أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Today we are continuing with part 8 of the explanation of the book The System of Islam. We discussed whether or not Islam was applied throughout the ages of the Khilafah. A lot of Muslims have this claim that throughout the ages that Islam wasn't implemented, or that it was always corrupt, and the Khilafah fell after 30 years, and all these very silly, shallow, misinformed claims. And they're just simply wrong. The Khilafah lasted until 1924. Islam was always implemented. There was a short period at the end of the Khilafah in the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, where the Tanzimat were implemented in Turkey in the Uthmani Khilafah, and this was due to the influence of the colonialists in tricking the young Khalifa at the time into thinking that it was in the best interest of non-Muslims coming to the state and so on. He didn't know what he was doing, and then in the end, it was passed based on the fatwas of the scholars saying that this is permissible in Islam. And then after a while, nobody used them, and then they were the laws were reversed, and they were like all these civil courts and separation of Islamic courts and civil courts were rejected, and the society went back to only having Islamic Sharia courts. And this lasted until 1924. So this idea that, and then we talked about the ruling system, specifically including the Khalifa and the judges. They only ever ruled by Islam, and we discussed why. We discussed a number of things related to the economic system and other systems as well. So there's one question that people talk about, which is that the bay'ah was corrupted from the time of Muawiyah onwards, and where it kind of became like an inheritance, almost like people claim that it's similar to the current kingdoms, and so therefore they try to say that it's the same thing and there's no difference. So this is where we're continuing from. A question may arise concerning the bay'ah, which is a pledge of allegiance to the Khalifa. It is an established fact that there was no hereditary system in the Khilafah. So some people claim that there is, and we're going to talk about why that's wrong. In other words, the hereditary system was not established in the state by which ruling the state leadership was acquired, as is the case in a monarchy. Instead, the state leadership would be acquired through receiving the bay'ah from the Muslims in some eras, from the influential people, which is called Ahl al-Hal wal-Aqd, not influential as in wealthy influential, rather the people, the leaders of society, the individuals that people trust, whether it's the scholars or whether it's just general speakers and people who are considered to be leaders in society in later eras. Or as what occurred towards the destruction of the Khilafah, which was from the statements and fatwas of Shaykh al-Islam. Throughout the ages of the Islamic State, the procedure was that no Khalifa was appointed without receiving the bay'ah. So no Khalifa throughout all of history was ever reached power except through the bay'ah. Never was a single incident reported that a Khalifa was appointed simply through inheritance without receiving the bay'ah. For example, if you look at like Mohammed bin Salman, the scumbag, corrupt, liar, hypocrite that right now is bringing any fahisha and immorality to the lands of the Mecca and Medina, he took power. He and his father took power purely based on hereditary. There's no question of if the people refuse, then he doesn't become the ruler. No, it's his right. It's his blood right, because it's a monarchy. Whereas under the Khilafah, throughout all of history, there was never a situation like that. It was always through the bay'ah, even though it went from a father to a son or to somebody within the family. That person never took power except through the people accepting it. So even though it was implicit, even though people just simply gave in and they just said, well, of course it's going to go to the son. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't still in the people's hands, because if the people said no, he doesn't become the Khalifa. That's basically the reality of what happened. So never was a single incident reported that a Khalifa was appointed through inheritance without receiving the bay'ah. However, notwithstanding this, the manner of attaining the bay'ah was misapplied. It was corrupt. Thus, a corrupted, but it was still Islam. It was a misapplication. Thus, a Khalifa would take a bay'ah from the people before his death for his son, his brother, cousin, or any other individual in the family. After the death of the Khalifa, the bay'ah was renewed for that person. This is a misapplication of the bay'ah, but it neither constitutes hereditary rule or succession to the throne. Likewise, the misapplication of the elections in a parliamentary or democratic system is still called elections and not an appointment, even if the government-backed candidates succeeded in the elections, even if the whole process of elections and the manipulating of votes and so on, even if it was corrupt, it's still an election. That's the main point. It doesn't mean that the system became some sort of an appointment system. Consequently, one must acknowledge that the Islamic system was applied throughout all periods of the Islamic State. As for the practical success of the Islamic intellectual leadership, it was without parallel, particularly in the it was without parallel. The success was without parallel, particularly in the following two matters. Firstly, the Islamic ideology transferred all the Arabs from a low level of intellect in which they were acting haphazardly in the darkness of bloody family feuds and ignorance to an age of intellectual revival glittering in the light of Islam, whose sunrise was not restricted just to the Arabs, but prevailed all around the world. Muslims rushed in conveying Islam to the world, putting their hands in the process over Persia, Iraq, the lands of al-Sham, which is from basically Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, to the north of Iraq, which includes Mosul, Egypt, and North Africa. Each of these peoples had their own religion, of course, including Syria. Each of these people had their own religion, nationality, language, customs, and traditions. All were different from one another. The nationality of Persians differed from that of the Romans, from that in Sham, from that of the Copts of Egypt, from that of the Berbers of North Africa. But once they lived under the rule of Islam and understood it, they all embraced it and became one nation, the Islamic Ummah. This lie that the West says that everyone was brought under Islam under the threat of sword, this is just a bunch of shallow, ignorant people babbling on the internet. This is one of the problems when everyone has a microphone. The clowns of the world also talk. The reality is that if it was true that everyone became Muslim under the sword, they would have ran from Islam as fast as they could as soon as that sword was lifted. Like we saw with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, when they oppressed people and they forced socialism on the people. And as soon as the Soviet Union fell, everyone ran back to their religions, Christianity, Islam, and so on and so forth. Everyone rushed away from it. So that's what happens when people are forced to believe in something against their will. But with Islam, people accepted it and they loved it, and they became our scholars, and they became our rulers. When Islam spread to these lands, these foreign lands that were not part of the original Arabs that brought Islam, they would go to Persia and they would go to Europe and so on. Including when we're talking about like Istanbul and so on, you find that the people themselves, and also when you look into Asia, when you go to Bukhara and so on, all the great scholars that come from there and from those regions, North Africa and deep into Asia, you find that the people themselves accepted these ideas and they became liberators for Islam. They became scholars for Islam, leaders for Islam. So this idea that people became Muslim under the sword is just a silly claim that has no basis. It's just some people talking. It's just words people say without having any evidence for it at all. They just say it, and people think, oh, well, somebody said it, therefore it must be true. Therefore, the success of the Islamic intellectual leadership in melting these peoples and nationalities into one nation was unparalleled. This is in spite of the fact that the means of transportation at the time was the camel, and the means of communication was the word of mouth and the writing of the pen. So it's not like we had phones and internet and so on. Al-Fatih, which is Islam spreading to a new land, conquest, however, was to remove by force so when we're talking about the jihad, basically, the army is going to a new land and bringing new lands under the rule of Islam. What was that? Somebody say, well, wasn't that by the sword? This was to remove by force the physical obstacles, meaning the military and the government, the oppressive government, to remove them. But the people were left alone. If you look at all of history, all the narrations, it shows that when Islam came to a new land, it removed the government, it removed the military, replaced it with an Islamic one, but people were left alone. People, if they didn't believe in Islam, they were generally left alone. Certain laws were, of course, changed to become more just, so taxation was changed and land laws were changed and so on. So now people had a lot more of their money back and they had more ownership of the wealth of the land. It was restored to them from the tyrants who stole everything. But people weren't forced to believe. They were just left alone. And people slowly saw the beauty of Islam and then they accept in large numbers. So it removes by force the physical obstacles to give the people free access towards what their minds and their innate nature guides them to. So they themselves found their way to Islam. In this manner, people entered Islam in masses, in large numbers. On the other hand, the oppressive conquering of countries alienates the conquerors from the conquered. For example, the colonization of the East by Western imperialism lasted for decades without gaining any result. If you look at what happened in India and so on, they never became British. They never became part of Europe. They never became part of the West. They're always colonized, and they're always poor, and their wealth is taken from them. If it was not for the influence of the deceptive Western culture and the oppression of its agents, which will soon vanish from the Muslim lands, inshallah, then the return of the domain of Islam in its ideology and system would be quicker than the blink of an eye. In the Muslim lands, same thing. Look at how the colonials brought all their ideas of freedom and democracy and all these lies, and yet if Muslims were allowed to return to Islam, the Khilafah would be reestablished today. But it's being stopped by the government and by oppression and by fear and by the Zionists and by our own government and so on. Accordingly, the success of the Islamic intellectual leadership in forging all the various peoples into one Islamic Ummah is without parallel. These peoples have remained as Muslims to this day, despite the colonialist calamities, wickedness, and planning and corrupting the creeds and poisoning the thoughts by bringing in nationalism and creating racism and making Saudis look down on everyone else, and the Iraqis look down on everyone else, and the Egyptians look down on everyone else, and Turks hate the Arabs, and the Arabs hate the Turks. All this poisoning and from the colonialism to divide and conquer us is dissolving and withering away. And when the Khilafah existed, people were united without any existence of racism. There's no history of racism in the history of the Khilafah. This is one of the amazing things. People think that racism is something that has always existed and will always exist. No, this is only in nationalistic capitalist societies, especially in the West. This is where racism is bred. This is where it's the seeds exist. And so this is the truth, is that the corruption is systemic in the system, whereas in the Khilafah, it solves these problems because the system is the cure, it's the solution. These people will remain one Islamic nation, one Ummah. All the Muslims today, no matter how much you divide them, we will still remain one Ummah until the Day of Judgment. It has never happened that any people or ethnic group that has embraced Islam as a group ever apostatized from Islam as a group. The example that people sometimes think of is, well, look at Spain. In Spain, they killed every single Muslim they could find. They said, don't leave one single Muslim alive, otherwise they will come back and take back this land. So they executed all the Muslims in Andalusia, Spain. So that's the only way that they've ever been able to clear out Muslims from like the spread of Islam and the rooting of Islam in an area is by literally just killing everybody. And this is the Christian history. The Christians are the ones who point at Muslims and say, oh, look how violent you are. And they have, so Muslims, there's only like claims without any evidence. But against Christians, they themselves know their history, and everyone knows their history and their bloody history and their killing and murdering and their arrogance and their white supremacy, and yet they just claim that, oh no, everyone else is oppressive and everyone else is an extremist and everyone else is violent. They have the most bloody and violent history, possibly in all of mankind's history. As for the Muslims in Andalusia, Spain, actually I just mentioned that, they were massacred by the courts of Inquisition, the guillotine, and burnt in the ovens of the executioners. The Muslims of Bukhara, the Caucasus, and Turkestan met with the same disastrous fate as those before them. The fact that these people embraced Islam and became one ummah the fact that these people embraced Islam and became one ummah that was concerned to protect their aqeedah portrays as evidence the degree of success of the Islamic intellectual leadership and the application of Islam by the Islamic State. On the second matter, which denotes the success of this ideology, is the fact that the Islamic Ummah was a leading nation in the world in respect to civilization, material advancement, culture, and science. So during the existence of the Khilafah, for the majority of its existence, it was almost always the leader in terms of organization of civilization, material, so technological advancement, in terms of culture and science. The Khilafah was always the shining light on the earth. When you look at the Dark Ages, 1600s, when Christian Europe was drowning in backwardness and killing each other and so on, and refusing to accept any technological advancements, believing the earth is flat, and so on and so forth, the Khilafah was the shining beacon of technological advancement in the world because of Islam. So the difference is that the West was in the deepest dark pits of ignorance due to Christianity, because Christianity doesn't have a system. So the clergy were just making things up as they go along. So it was corrupt human beings who were making the laws, and that's why the West's experience with religion is the faults and the incapability of Christianity. And they insist that all religions must be the same. Because again, they had the same ignorant approach that when they looked at the Dark Ages, they said, well, the way to solve this is by separating church from state. So instead of asking, should God tell us what to do? Is there another religion? That same ignorance exists today. They said Christianity is bad, all religions are bad, and therefore Islam is bad. And therefore secularism is the only answer, and Muslims are not allowed to rule with Islam because secularism is the only thing that's allowed. Now, of course, add on top of that, really what it is that they want to be able to control the wealth of the Muslim lands. And so they are not going to allow Muslims to rise up, not only because they want everyone to be under their system, secularism, but they want control, wealth, power, access, and so on. For 12 centuries, dating from the 7th century CE to the middle of the 18th century CE, the Islamic State remained as the leading and most powerful state in the world. So 11 centuries, 1100 years. Throughout this period, it was the flower of the globe and the rising sun among nations, a fact that confirms the success of this intellectual leadership and the success of Islam in implementing a system and aqidah upon the people. When the Islamic State and Ummah abandoned carrying its intellectual leadership and fell short in understanding and applying Islam, it lapsed and declined among other nations, and the Khilafah fell. So it's because we abandoned the implementation of Islam and the way that Islam teaches us to think. We started thinking like the West, and we became a mishmash, mixed up, confused society where we didn't know our direction anymore. That's the reason why the Ummah failed, not because of Islam. And it's not because of religion, to counter what the secularists claim. Therefore, we say that only the Islamic intellectual leadership is correct, and it alone should be carried to the world. When the Islamic State, which carries this leadership, is established, the success of this leadership will be realized today as it was before. We do expect that, of course, once the Khilafah is reestablished, the world will see its justice. And because the thing is about this is that a human being only understands things through contrast. So when the best system in the world, like in terms of prosperity and comforts and so on, is like Canada, US, parts of Europe, and you compare that to how horrible things are under some governments in the Muslim lands and the more poverty-stricken parts of Asia and so on, people say, oh, well, look at how great this system is. So that's because we only understand through contrast. And when we talk about the Khilafah, would be like, they're like, this is a fantasy. This is like la la dreamland. You know, that's not going to happen. And so when the Khilafah is reestablished, people will see for themselves what the system looks like. And if it is what we say it is, and inshallah, of course, it should be, and inshallah it will be, then what will happen is that people will now compare their system to that. And they'll say, well, these guys, you know, like aside from the fact that we don't have taxes and we have, and the government is not these elitist, wealthy people, it's just regular people who truly, sincerely care, and they're very moral and upright and good people. The land laws and the ownership and the currency system and so on, the morality and the respect for each other, male and female, and the lack of psychological confusion that exists in the West, and the absence of all these issues like depression and anxiety and so on that exists. Of course, people will have some issues, but it's nothing like the depression and the suicidal issues and so on that exists in the West. But aside from all these things, which are material gains, the thing that people will notice is the presence of a spiritual lifestyle in everyday life, including economic transactions and political dealings and even military issues. So suddenly everything is intrinsically linked to a spiritual connection with a creator. Think about this. Somebody said this, and I thought it was such a beautiful saying. He said, what speaker said, imagine what it would be like if pleasing Allah was a national interest, if it was a national policy, part of the national policy to please Allah Azza wa Jal. So the government, one of the objectives of the government, like if you look at it as a national policy and one of the national interests of every country, for example, to protect its borders, to preserve whatever liberties or freedoms they have, or to protect the GDP or the economy and growth and so on, all these different things. So and also maybe to have good relations with your neighbor and trade and business. So also always money and dunya stuff, like material stuff. Imagine if there was a khilafah, a state, and the state's national interest as a state was to please Allah Azza wa Jal. Imagine what it would do in terms of taking care of people's affairs and dealing with wealth and so on. As a state, it's more concerned with pleasing Allah Azza wa Jal than anything else. Everything else falls under that. And therefore, all systems will be taken care of with consciousness of Allah Azza wa Jal watching us. It's an amazing thing. And again, the problem with this idea when you're talking to non-Muslims is people might say, hey, well, you know, this is basically just a fantasy. And yeah, it sounds like a fantasy. But once we implement it, then people will see, and this is what we're talking about, is once this leadership is restored, once the Islamic ideological system is restored, the success of the leadership, just like it was so massively successful in history, it'll be massively successful, inshallah, again. And then people will know why so many millions in the millions came to Islam at once, because they'll see what it's like today and they'll say, now we get it. But most people are not going to believe it because they're going to say, well, they're only going to believe what they see in the media and basically propaganda by the capitalist West that's trying to stop Muslims from rising up and becoming politically independent. Now, the next paragraph, we have proven that Islam, with its aqidah and its system that emanates from it, agrees with man's nature. Consequently, Islam does not view man as a mechanical being functioning accurately like a machine, and implementing the system on the basis of fine mathematical measures without disparity. On the contrary, from the Islamic perspective, man is a social being who applies the system with varying capabilities and qualities. Thus, it is natural for Islam, on the one hand, to narrow the gap between people without making everyone equal, while guaranteeing tranquility for all. On the other hand, it is also natural to find some individuals who deviate from the system and thus don't comply with it, and others who do not respond or who turn away from the system. Inevitably, there will be in the society people fusaq. So, evildoers is not the best translation necessarily. Fusaq are people who commit sins regularly. They just live a life of sin and they don't really care. People who indulge in vices, fujjar, and this also a more precise translation is people who commit sins publicly without shame. So fusaq are people who just live in corruption, but they might hide it, but they just disobey Allah Azza wa Jal. Fujjar are people who commit sins and do it publicly without shame. Because people who just do, it's almost like they just blow open the doors of their sin and transgression, and they don't care. Kuffar, disbelievers. Munafiqun, which are hypocrites, people who pretend to be Muslims or pretend to be good people, but in reality they're not. They pretend to be pious, but they're actually not. Apostates, murtadun, people who used to be Muslim and left. Atheists, mulhidun, people who don't believe in a creator altogether, and so on. The important thing is that the society as a whole, from the point of view of its thoughts, emotions, systems, and people, is considered as an Islamic society, which applies Islam when these elements manifest themselves as Islamic. So the important thing is that it's important to understand that it's a human society. It's not a society of angels. So people are going to make mistakes and accidents are going to happen and corruption is going to happen and so on. But the state's responsible for managing, and the Muslims are responsible for accounting each other and watching out for society. Basically, that's the gist of it. So there's going to be good and bad and so on. But the overwhelming nature has to be that it's good. And to create a parallel, just to better understand this, is not that there's a parallel between these two, but just to draw the concept closer, is that if you look at Western societies, it's the same thing, even though there are people who transgress liberties and reject freedom and commit crimes and do whatever. That doesn't change the fact that it's still a liberal society, and it's still a society that's based on capitalism, secularism, democracy, and the four freedoms. So even though there's people who transgress and break the rules and reject the rules and so on, as long as the overwhelming nature of society is a capitalist, secular, democratic society, then it's a capitalist society. So in Islam, and of course the example is a much superior example, is that in Islam, there's going to be some people who are going to commit sins, but the difference, of course, is the kinds of crimes that people will commit under khilaf will be very different, because the environment will be much more connected to the concept of obeying the Creator and living a good moral life. Whereas in the West, it's very individualistic and self-centered. That's why you have like the Karens and a lot of entitlement. And that's why it creates white entitlement. And people who are like, well, we are the original white people and everyone else is beneath us. So this is the Western societies create this arrogance. Whereas in the Khilafah, it's going to create a sense of morality. The concept of you're being washed by God. Even if you don't even believe in Islam, the environment of people who believe this around you is going to affect you. And I see this here actually in Canada. So I've noticed in my life, especially after Gaza, a lot of people are very much watching Muslims now. So they're watching Muslims not like they used to back in the Harper days, where they used to look at Muslims with suspicion and hate and whatever. No, they're actually looking at Muslims with interest and admiration. So now when we talk about praying and fasting and so on, people are really, really interested in knowing. Wherever I go now, it's very different. Before, they would look at us like as foreigners and weirdos and so on. And even your fasting, like that's weird. How can you handle it and so on? But now when we talk to people, I find that people are so interested, right? So when you talk to people about the idea of we fast for the sake of God, we pray to God 5 times a day, we have small things that we do just as an automatic thing. We leave the house, we say, Bismillah, tawakkaltu ala Allah, wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. So we make a dua before we leave the house. When we get in the car, there's a prayer. When we enter a marketplace, there's a prayer. When we return to the house, there's a prayer. When you go to the washroom, there's a prayer. When you leave the washroom, there's a prayer. When you begin to eat, there's a prayer, etc., etc. All these sorts of things, there's a connection to our Creator in so many different ways. So what that does, what I've noticed, is that the non-Muslims who don't live a spiritual life, although they'll say like, I'm not sure if I can do this, whatever, but you can tell that they are interested in this idea of living this life connected to morality. But this is just a few individuals against the masses. So that's the thing. They're not going to be swayed very quickly or very easily, because the dominant environment is that, well, we're all just living a Canadian lifestyle. But in an Islamic society where people are living like this, and people are now seeing the morality of society, it's going to affect people who are living in that society. They're going to want to be more moral. They're going to want to be more connected to their creator. They're going to want to try to, at minimum, kind of match what Muslims do. And I even notice this with a lot of Christians. Like, let's say when you get married to a Christian, and then, you get married to an ex-Christian, like a convert, but their family are still Christian. And so one thing that I noticed with a lot of these families, like whether it's my own experience or others, what I've noticed is that they were not practicing Christians before their daughter or their son or someone from their family became Muslim and married into a Muslim family. But then they start getting exposed to the Muslim lifestyle, where everything's connected to Allah Azza wa Jal. You talk about Allah Azza wa Jal, you talk about politics with Allah Azza wa Jal connected to it, Islam. You talk about economics with Islam connected, your business with Islam connected, your travels with Islam connected, your children with Islam connected. So suddenly everything is about the laws of Islam. And suddenly you see them starting to act more Christian. They start going to church more often. They start talking about God more often. And sometimes they start trying to compete. They're like, well, Christianity is, superior. And they start trying to defend a religion that I've, with my own ears, had heard some Christians originally, at the very beginning, they would mock their own religion and attack their own book and hate their own religion. But then when they see how strong Muslims are, they start standing up for Christianity, because it brings about this feeling of like the admiration for what Muslims have. And they want to have it too. They either become Muslim, which is a lot of what happened in history. That's why millions became Muslims so quickly. Or they become stronger in their own religions because they're trying to match that. That's human nature. When humans see something good, that's the point. So, the next paragraph, we're saying that the evidence for this, the Islamic society is a human nature society, and we have to accept that as such. And also, this is the point. The point of this is that we as Muslims not only have to be more forgiving towards each other in everyday life now, like even though there's bad Muslims, it's fine. We can still work towards change. But also, for those working towards actual change, if a day comes that we become the leaders of the Ummah and we're taking care of society, we have to understand that these things are going to exist, and we have to be prepared to think about how we're going to deal with it. Instead of being like, everybody has to be perfect. No. We're going to try to make everyone perfect, but it's not. But we should know that, yeah, some bad things are going to happen, and we have to apply whatever laws are related in order to minimize the bad and rectify and fix things and so on. So the evidence for this is that it is impossible for anyone to apply a system at the level of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's application. Despite this, at his sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time, there were also disbelievers, hypocrites, apostates, atheists, evildoers, and people who indulge in vices. So when we're saying evildoers, we mean fusaq, and people who indulge in vices, we're talking about fujjar. Therefore, no one can claim that Islam was not applied completely, or that the society was non-Islamic. Yet the Islamic application is on man as a social being, not a mechanical being. So Islam continued to be applied on the entire Ummah, Arab and non-Arab, from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, since he settled down in Medina, till the colonial powers occupied the Islamic lands, after World War I, and replace Islam with the capitalist system. Thus, Islam was implemented from the first year of the Hijrah, 1336 after Hijrah, or 1918. From the first year of Hijrah until 1336 after Hijrah, 1918 current era, and the Islamic Ummah did not apply any system other than Islam throughout this period. Although the Muslims translated books of philosophy, so this is a really interesting point. This is yet another point to prove that Islam was always applied. Although the Muslims translated books of philosophy, science, and different foreign cultures into Arabic, they never translated any legislation, system, canon, or any other nations, neither for research, debate, discussion, or application. Considering Islam to be a system, some people applied it well and others misapplied it. So before we get to that point, that's a really, really profound point, which a lot of people say that, Islam was not applied and it was always corrupt. And then they try to say that, and the governments today are also corrupt. Again, these are corrupt people trying to get us to accept the current systems. So what's amazing about this is that if you go, like, we all know what Muslims did with philosophy. Muslims translated thousands of books of philosophy, and they drowned in the debates of ilm al-kalam, which is the discussions of, Ibn Rushd and all these famous Al-Ghazali and all these debates that took place during that time. They translated books of science, and they translated books of different culture and different languages and so on. They translated so much that they got from Greek philosophy and the books of Europe and so on. There's not one single book of legislation that discusses legislation. Democracy was all there. It was all filled in those books. They didn't even give it a moment's interest. They did not translate it. They did not discuss it. They did not analyze it. It was instantly rejected because the concept that Allah is the legislator was so clear and so firm. The idea of looking into other man-made law was completely a joke. It's like today somebody saying, let's go and translate the legislation process of parliament and then try to study that as Muslims and try to understand. We don't care. This is man-made law. Muslims might study what atheists are discussing and what Christians are talking about and so on. We might take that and translate it and debate it and discuss it because it's something that it allows us to better understand other people and our own beliefs and contrasting, comparing. But the legislation is something that we just instantly and entirely reject because the idea of even looking at man-made law is not even a possibility for us. That's yet another very, very powerful proof that Islam was always applied throughout all of the history of the implementation of Islam, from the Prophet ﷺ until the end of until after World War I, or in the fall of the Khilafah. So, considering Islam to be a system, some people applied it well and others misapplied it. This depended on the strength or weakness of the state and on the degree of its comprehension of Islam or lack of understanding, and according to whether it was strong or complacent in carrying its intellectual leadership. Consequently, the misapplication of Islam in some ages brought about some decline in the Islamic society. But this is something that no system can avoid because the application of the system depends on human beings. However, the misapplication did not mean that Islam was not implemented. Absolutely, Islam was implemented and no other system or ideology was applied. This is because the crucial point is in the applying of the canons and systems enacted by the state. In this respect, the state did not adopt any canon or system alien to Islam. What occurred was the misapplication of some of the rules by some of the rulers. So an example of this is, some people say, well, look at how they torture people and kill people. And look what happened to Imam Ibn Hanbal and what happened to Sa'id ibn Jubair and all these sorts of things. So what all those situations were was not all, but the vast majority of these situations that are talking about the ruler oppressing people and throwing them in jail and so on, they even went after Imam Malik and so on, was that the Khalifa would order these people to do something, and they believed it was wrong. They believed that he was wrong in ordering it, or he was misinformed, or he was misguided for doing so. He would, for example, order Imam Malik to become the part of the state structure. And Imam Malik said, I don't want to be part of the state structure. He saw it as corrupt, as in not corrupt like today corrupt. Corrupt then compared to the time of the Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali. So that's subhanAllah, and that's how if we had that Khalifa at that time ruling over us today, he would be the Mahdi. So but because they were so close to the time of the Sahaba, they were comparing to the time of the Sahaba, and they saw that this decline is too much. They had no idea how bad it was going to get. So he refused to be part of the government, and so the Khalifa at the time wanted to punish him. And the same for a lot of other scholars and so on who were oppressed by rulers. Basically, the ruler was misapplying the rule of rebellion, which is that if somebody disobeys the Khalifa has the right to punish that person. But they shouldn't have punished the people for the things that they did, because a lot of these things the Khalifa should not have gotten involved in, should not have demanded it from the people. However, notwithstanding this, one must observe 2 points when examining the implementation of Islam throughout history. The first point is that history must not be taken from the enemies of Islam who harbor hatred towards it. So we must not take our history from Western sources, from Orientalists, from Western historians, capitalist, non-Muslim historians. We must never take any of our history from them. Not any analysis, not narrations, nothing at all. We only look at our own books and we only analyze it through our own lens. We only analyze our own history. We don't take it from the enemies of Islam, because they are going to manipulate and twist things. They're always going to say things like, the Harun Rashid had a harem. They even use the word harem, where they had hundreds of slave girls and things like this. There's no evidence for this. They just say these things. They analyze Islam to have been, weak during a time. Like there's even a movie. There's a series on Netflix about. It was about Muhammad al-Fatih. I don't know if any of you have seen it, and it's a show about I forget what they call it, but anyway, it's about Muhammad al-Fatih, and they portray him as a petty, jealous, self-absorbed person who's only seeking to bring Constantinople under Islam because of perception on him and expectations of him and revenge and frustration, and they basically paint him as a child. I've seen Muslims watch the show and be like, wow, this is an amazing show. It's absolute manipulative garbage. And I remember actually a family member of mine was watching it, and she was just really, she was having a great time with it. And then I said, hold on a second, I doubt that this is going to be a good show. These types of shows are done by Orientalists and non-Muslims and so on. We don't ever take our history from them. So we watched it again, and while we're watching, I was commenting. By the time we were done one episode, she said, I had absolutely no idea. I had no idea how bad this show was. She didn't even recognize how bad it was in trying to corrupt us. She's like, now she sees how petty he is and how much of a loser he is in this show. And she said that she can see that how much they're trying to portray Muslims as bloodthirsty and angry, and they kill their own people. Like he walked into one of his guys and just killed him. He didn't do that. How can he kill somebody, one of the Muslims, over just some sort of the cannon didn't work? And he would tell them, fire the cannon, and they're saying it's going to explode, and he says, no, fire the cannon, and then it blows up in his face. That didn't happen. Who said this happened? These are all lies by the colonialists, and especially, by the way, if you look at what history says about Abdul Hamid II and how they portray him as being petty and greedy and malicious and etc. etc. But this because he rejected their offers, the offers of the Jews of Herzl to have to be able to buy land, some of the land in Palestine, in Al-Quds, what they currently call Jerusalem. So he rejected their offers, and so they portray him as a vile, lowly loser. But the reality is that they're the lowly, vile losers. So we don't take our history from the enemies of Islam under any circumstances. And I see a lot of Muslims often, they'll cite, especially brothers who are working in universities and so on. They're very academic and they don't see straight. They'll use any sources that are reliable academic sources, and they are Orientalist sources. Orientalist sources especially must never be referred to under any circumstance. Instead, history must be taken from the Muslims themselves after an extensive research so as not to adopt a distorted image. But then also from that, we talk a little, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, which is that we don't take from Muslims blindly, because a lot of Muslims will narrate history inaccurately because they're humans and they might exaggerate for or against somebody. So there's a process to this. So the second point is that the generalization and study of the society should not be taken from the history of individuals or from one aspect of society. For example, it would be wrong to pass judgment on the history of the Umayyad era by studying the history of Yazid's era, or to pass judgment on the history of the Abbasid era on some incidents with their khulafa. Likewise, we must not pass judgment on the society of the Abbasid era from the book Kitab al-Aghani, which is a book of poetry and songs, which was written to narrate stories of the recklessly extravagant people, poets and authors, or reading the books of Zuhud, which are like excessive abandonment of material pleasures and the like, and thus are thinking that the entire society was either in a state of extravagance and sin or asceticism and isolation. Rather, we have to study the whole society. So here's an interesting thing. The interesting thing here is that when people talk about, oh, look how the Khilafah was always corrupt. If you think about it carefully and think about what you've read about the Khilafah, you've only really read about small conflicts, about just a few people among the rulers. Have you read about people in society killing each other and fighting, just the average citizen? The average citizen was just living an Islamic lifestyle. Just because there were struggles at the peak of power, basically the khulafa or between walis or whatever, like walis and the khalifa towards the end, that doesn't mean that the whole society was in turmoil and everyone was killing and fighting each other. Just like right now, when you see the Democrats and the Republicans are at each other's throats, in the U.S. doesn't mean that they are that the whole society is all killing and fighting in the streets and so on. So this idea of taking a small number of narrations about a small area of conflict or some issues going on between the Khalifa and a scholar and so on, and then saying the whole society is like this is completely wrong and unacceptable. We have to acknowledge, however, that the whole history of the Islamic society as a society in any era was never written. What has been written, rather, is the affairs of the rulers and some officials. Those who wrote such history were not trustworthy. They were either slanderers, so they spoke negatively about the state, or adulators, who spoke way too highly of the state because they're kissing up, and whatever they wrote can't be accepted without investigation. When the Islamic society is studied on this basis, i.e. to study it from all of its aspects and through thorough investigation, it can be found to be the best society. That's why you have to take a step back and reanalyze the information you have. Remove all the things that come from non-Muslim sources, and remove all the things that come from Muslim sources that we haven't investigated whether or not they're accurate. And you're left with very little. And what you have of that very little, it shows that it was a completely Islamic society. Since it was so for the first, second, and third centuries, in fact, right up to the middle of the 12th century Hijrah, that it was the best of societies in the world. One finds that the society applied Islam throughout all its ages, right up to the end of the Uthmani Khilafah as an Islamic state. However, history should not be taken as a source for studying the system in fiqh. So we don't look at what the Uthmanis did as a source of what we should do. We don't look at what the Abbasids did or what the Umayyads did and so on. We don't look at what they did as a source of what we should do. We're not trying to replicate or bring back what they were or what they were or what they represent. Rather, we only go back to, the system should be taken from the sources of jurisprudence and not from history, meaning the Quran and Sunnah, since history is not one of its sources in terms of Islamic legislation. Accordingly, to understand the communist system, one does not draw conclusions from the history of Russia, but from the books of the communist ideology itself. So if you want to understand how Russia applied communism, you look at Russia. But if you want to understand what communism actually is, you go to the books of communism. Likewise, if to understand the English jurisprudence, like the jurisprudence of England, one should not take it from the history of England, but rather from the books of English jurisprudence. This applies to any system or canon. Islam is an ideology with its own aqidah and system. Consequently, those who wish to understand it must not use history as a source, neither for knowledge nor for deducing the rules. The source of understanding Islam is the books of Islamic fiqh. Fiqh is the meaning fiqh means comprehension, meaning the comprehension of the Islamic laws. What it really means, Islamic fiqh is the conclusions of Islamic laws by scholars who've looked in the Quran and Sunnah and derived the laws from those books. So the books of Islamic fiqh and the source for deducing its rules and their detailed evidences, meaning the Quran and Sunnah. Thus, history is not the correct source for the Islamic system, neither for its understanding nor for its deduction. It is therefore incorrect to take the history of Umar ibn Khattab or Umar ibn Abdul Aziz or Harun al-Rashid, whether from historical events ascribed to them or from the books written during their respective periods, as a source of ahkam shar'iyyah. If an opinion of Umar is followed in a question, it is followed in its capacity as a hukm shari deduced and applied by Umar. So you can follow Umar's opinion as a scholar of Islam. But Umar is not a source of law in Islam. Because Umar is a scholar, basically. We look at him as an alim and a mujtahid among the ulama and mujtahideen, and one of the greatest ones. But he's not one of the sources. The sources of Islam is Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Sahaba, and Qiyas. As is the case with the ahkam shar'iyyah deduced by Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ja'far, and others, it is not adopted as a historical event. History, accordingly, has nothing to do with adopting or knowing the system. Moreover, ascertaining whether or not the system was applied, fiqh rather than history is the reference for determining that. So we find out the fiqh, the correct understanding, and then we see if history applied it. This is because every era has its own problems, which were tackled by a system. So in order to find the system used to solve problems, one must refer to the Islamic fiqh and not to the events of history, because it only reports to us the news as they are. When reference is made to the Islamic fiqh, one neither finds it in any system taken by the Muslims from others, nor any system chosen by the Muslims from themselves. Instead, one finds it completely as ahkam shar'iyyah, or the ahkam shar'iyyah deduced from the Shari'i evidences. Muslims were very careful to sift into the jurisprudence by removing any deficient opinions, i.e. deficient ijtihad. They were even prohibited, they even prohibited others from acting according to weak opinions, even if it was ascribed to a great mujtahid mutlaq. As a result, there is not one single legislative text other than the Islamic fiqh throughout the Islamic world. The fact that only one body of jurisprudence exists in a nation without any other accompanying text signifies that the nation did not use any other text in legislation. So this is yet another evidence that proves that Islam was only implemented because when you look at all the books that exist about legislation in society, there were only the books of fiqh. There's no other books. You can't find anything else. So if it were permitted to give attention to history, this would be confined to examining the way of applying the system. History might also contain political events from which the way of application can be seen. Even this should not be taken except after thorough research and from Muslims. So we can look at history on how they applied it and learn from that mistakes that they made and successes that they had. But even then, we have to be careful about making sure that this is the correct history. And of course, first knowing the law from the text of Quran and Sunnah, whether or not they even knew the correct hukm in the first place. History has three sources. So now we're going to talk about how do we verify history. History has three sources: history books, and this is a really interesting topic: history books, archaeological objects, and books of narration. So narration meaning somebody told somebody who told a narrator. So just like Imam Bukhari. So Tarikh al-Tabari and Tarikh ibn Hisham and so on. This is books of narration, which means that the history was written based on narrators, not just one guy just saying, well, this happened and this happened and this happened. No, it's a book of narration that says such and such, like this person told this person that this happened. So the person who said that this happened knew somebody who witnessed it, or knew somebody who witnessed it. So it's a narration, it's a chain of narration of the event going back through individuals who were verified. So they don't just say, well, I'm talking to you and I'm just going to believe your chain. They will verify the chain just like they verify the chains of ahadith. Historical books should not be considered as a source because they are influenced by the political conditions of the time. They are filled with lies, either supporting the people at whose time these books were written or attacking those at the time the books were written. And you can see this today a lot. You find all sorts of books that are talking about the political situation, and either they're just absolutely trashing everything about the person or praising them as if they're angels walking the earth. Like you see, for example, with Trump. People, write books about him as if he is literally chosen by God, right? Literally guided by Jesus. Things like this. So you can't just accept a history book written by just anybody. A recent example of this is the history of the Alawite family in Egypt. Prior to 1952, current era, it had a bright image in the history books. But after 1952, its image was dark. So during the time when they were powerful, they had books that just said the most beautiful things about them. And then when they became weak, everything just was against them, and everyone's saying that they're evil and horrible. And they're talking even about the previous history, not recent, but their whole history. The same applies to the history of other political events now and in the past. For this reason, history books should not be considered as a source of history, even if they were biographies written by their own people, because it's unreliable. Archaeological objects. This is what makes this section of the book so interesting. Archaeological objects, excavation and antiquities would provide historical facts if studied honestly. Although they by themselves do not provide a historical timeline, they, however, denote occurrence of some events. If one examines the Islamic antiquities found in their countries, be they buildings, instruments, and other things, one can conclude that nothing was present in the Islamic world except Islam, the system of Islam, and the rules of Islam. Additionally, the Muslims' way of life and actions conducted were Islamic. So think about this. If let's say something were to happen to the United States, or something were to happen to Greece, or something were to happen to France, or to Spain, or to Germany, and so on, and everyone was wiped out, and it was abandoned for 100 years. And then everyone comes back and looks at the leftovers, the archaeological leftovers. And it's a barren land covered in dirt and dust, and everything is kind of like rotting away and so on. But people are cleaning it up, and they're finding all the magazines and the posters and the billboards and the design of the houses and the design of the buildings and the statues that are outside and all the things around society. You would conclude that this is a society that you see the way people are dressed. you would see the nudity that exists. You would see all the immorality, the signs of immorality. You would see the houses with massive windows and no curtains. So that means they didn't really care about the privacy of the home. You would see all these examples that would indicate the lifestyle. It would give you a hint on what life was actually like. If we look at history, a lot of these nations before us, like if you look at India, you see it's filled with statues of naked this and naked that and so on. You find all the statues again in Greece, they're all filled with just statues of naked people and depicting prophets naked and so on. So you can tell how sick of these societies were. It doesn't tell you the whole story, but it tells you the elements of society that existed that were normal. Now, if you look at the Muslim lands, look at all of the archaeological findings. You don't find anything like that. You don't find naked women. You don't find sexual depictions. The things that remain, all the monuments and all the big buildings that remain are what? Huge mosques. If there's statues that exist, they have their noses broken off. And so this was something that was known because one of the things that Muslims did, because they didn't want to have to, sometimes a stone was big and difficult to smash. So instead of smashing the whole statue, they would break off its nose because what you're trying to break is people's reverence for that thing. So when you break its nose, you've humiliated the thing, like it's humiliated because it doesn't have a nose. And so people wouldn't want to worship this because the nose is broken. Like you look at the Sphinx, its nose is broken. If you look at a lot of the statues throughout all of the, like Al-Sham, Syria, and so on, all the statues' noses are broken. In Lebanon, statues are broken, noses are broken. Iraq, same thing. So these are all indicators that they're of the Islamic lifestyle that existed. So if you look at all the archaeological objects, even if you look at the vases and the plates and the paintings and so on, they almost 100%. There's a few paintings right towards the end. They're influenced by some Persian influences and so on that have some depictions that are un-Islamic, but 99.9% of everything, like I said, all the like art and the coins, the dinar had Islamic. Even if you look right now, when you look at the coins, what would you conclude of every single nation when you look at the money? You would conclude that the Queen of England was very special to them. You would conclude that the colonialist founders, the settlers were really important. Mount Rushmore is very important. So lots of statues and so on about their leaders and the colonialists and so on. You look at the Islamic money, all of history, it has Islamic writing on it. La ilaha illallah, things about rizq, things about putting your trust in Allah Azza wa Jal. You look at their jewelry. All their jewelry revolves around Islamic ideas and etiquette. You find the name of Allah on it. You find ayat of the Quran on it and so on. So you see all of the things that existed in architectural or archaeological, the excavation and all these things that remain, they're all clearly depicting an Islamic lifestyle. As for the third source, i.e. narration, it is a correct source which can be relied on if the narration was correct and the method followed in collecting the narration was the same as the method followed in collecting the hadith. This is the manner in which history should be recorded. The Muslims followed this method of narration when they commenced writing in the early days. The classical books of history, such as the Tarikh al-Tabari, the History of al-Tabari, and Sirat ibn Hisham, were written according to this method. Muslims should not teach their children from the books of history whose sources are other books of history. You got to be careful of that. Lots of times a book of history, like an analysis of history, will be written, and then the source is another book of history. So then you go to that book of history, and then who knows what its reference is. So you can't just simply accept another book and another. You have to find what was the source of this historical event. An overview of the application of the Islamic system should not be taken from those books of history either. In conclusion, it is evident that Islam alone was implemented and nothing else was applied throughout all the periods. However, since the end of the First World War, which ended with the Allies, the West victory, the Allies meaning like France and Britain and France and so on, their victory over basically the Ottoman Khilafah in Germany and so on, culminating with the announcement of Lord Allenby, the commander of the campaign when occupying Jerusalem and Quds, stated, "Now the Crusades are over." So this was about the Crusades and about capitalism and capitalist colonialism. The capitalist colonialists have applied upon us since then the capitalist system in all matters of life, to perpetuate the victory they achieved over us. We must therefore get rid of this rotten and corrupt system by which the colonials control our countries. We have to completely uproot it once and for all so that we can resume the Islamic way of life. It is low, superficial thinking to replace our system with any other system, and it is shallow thinking to consider that if the Ummah apply the system without its aqeedah, it would be saved. The Ummah must embrace the aqeedah first and then apply the system emanating from this doctrine. The implementation of the system and embracing of the doctrine will then be a savior. This applies to the Ummah, which is built upon the ideology and the state, which is established upon this basis. As for the other peoples and nations, it is not necessary that they embrace the ideology as a prerequisite for applying the ideology upon them. So the point here is that it's not acceptable for us just to have the aqeedah and apply a different system other than the Islamic system. That's nonsense. And it would be wrong for us to apply the system and have a different aqeedah, like the secularist aqeedah or the capitalist aqeedah, but apply parts of the system or whatever it might be, or to apply the laws of Islam saying that they make a lot of sense and there's benefit in it, because let's say you go based on democracy and you take man-made law, and then you say that, well, even though we as a people are adopting the aqeedah of capitalism and we're implementing the system of democracy, but we're going to apply the laws of Islam because they're good laws. They make a lot of sense. Both situations would lead to the failure of that society. The Ummah must accept the aqeedah first and then apply the system based on it. But this doesn't mean that the people who the laws are being applied to have to become Muslim. No, they can just stay with whatever beliefs that they have. That's fine, as long as they obey the law. That's just like in any society. You have to obey the law. The nation that embraces the ideology and conveys it to others can apply it on any people or any nation, even if they don't believe in it. This is because the ideology will also result in the revival of that nation and will attract them to believe in it just naturally, just like anybody who comes to the West and they become attracted to this corrupt system. But it's better than a lot of what exists. Like, it's perceived to be better than everything else. So when people see the khilaf and they see how much more superior it is to anything made by human beings, then the same thing will happen. They'll see it and they'll be attracted to it. So there's no need. Not to mention, not only is there no need, but it's actually not allowed to force anybody to become Muslim. So the state just simply applies Islam on society, and people will come to Islam when they become convinced by it. Thus, embracing the ideology is not a condition for those on which it is applied. Rather, it is an essential condition for those who implement it. So we're not talking about those who it's applied on, only those who implement it. It is dangerous to adopt nationalism in conjunction with socialism. Now, this paragraph is referring to what the Muslims did in the Arab world back in the time of like Saddam Hussein and this Arab socialism. So it doesn't really apply today, but some Muslims, older, still adopt this absolutely ridiculous idea, which is they were Arab nationalists with socialism as they believe that socialism would save us. It is dangerous to adopt nationalism in conjunction with socialism. Socialism cannot be separated from its materialist idea because it will not be productive or influential. Neither can socialism be adopted together with this materialistic idea, since it is a negative thought which contradicts man's nature. We talked about all these things previously. Furthermore, its adoption would mean that the Islamic nation would have to abandon the Islamic aqeedah. We cannot adopt socialism and simultaneously retain the spiritual aspect of Islam. This would result in adopting neither Islam nor socialism by virtue of the fact that they contradict each other, and whatever was adopted would be incomplete. Similarly, we cannot adopt the system of Islam devoid of its aqeedah, from which its system emanates, as this means the adoption of an imperious system devoid of spirit. Instead, we must adopt Islam wholly with its aqeedah and systems and convey its intellectual leadership when we carry the da'wah for it. Accordingly, there is only one way to attain our revival, which is the resumption of the Islamic way of life, and there is no way to resume the Islamic way of life except through establishing the Islamic state. This cannot be achieved unless we totally adopt both Islam, both as an aqeedah, which solves the greatest problem in terms of our perspective on why we exist, and upon which man's viewpoint in this life is concentrated, and as a system which emanates from this doctrine. The basis of such systems is the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Sunnah of His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Its cultural treasures are fiqh, hadith, tafsir, Arabic language, and others. No method can achieve this except by carrying the Islamic intellectual leadership completely through the da'wah to Islam and establishing Islam completely everywhere. Once the intellectual leadership has been transmitted to the nation as a whole and to the Islamic state, we embark upon carrying the intellectual leadership to the rest of the world. This is the only way to achieve the revival, to convey the Islamic intellectual leadership to Muslims so as to resume the Islamic way of life and to deliver it to all of mankind by means of the Islamic State thereafter. This is the chapter of the Islamic intellectual leadership. It covers all the points related to how we think as Muslims, as ideological Muslims, how we perceive society, how we perceive how to solve problems in society. It's a chapter that people should be studying and reviewing for years to gain greater depth into it and greater understanding. So hopefully that we'll be able to always analyze society from the correct perspective, and also notice when certain things, they look like they don't contradict Islam, but since we know that they come from socialism, we know that they come from capitalism, secularism, democracy, whatever else it might be, materialism as the aqeedah and so on, and that's why we would reject it, because we know where it comes from. It comes from a foreign ideology. And so that's the difference. That's how we understand how ideologies work. We're done for today. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.